Robin Williams stood up in the middle of a sentence, mid-joke, mid-laugh, and simply stopped being funny. The transformation happened so fast that the studio audience did not immediately understand what they were witnessing. The same energy that had just produced 6 straight minutes of the fastest. Most electric comedy any of them had ever seen live suddenly collapsing into something raw and unguarded and frightened. He walked, almost stumbled away from his chair, out from behind the desk, toward the edge of the stage, his hands pressed against his own face. And Fred Rogers, 60 years old, wearing the same cardigan he wore on children's television 5 days a week, stood up from his own chair without a single second of hesitation, walked directly toward one of the most explosively talented comedians in America, and simply took his hand. Wait, because what happened? In the 90 seconds after Fred Rogers closed his fingers around Robin Williams' trembling hand explained something about both men that almost nobody watching that broadcast fully understood. Something that goes back to a very particular kind of exhaustion that lives underneath extraordinary talent, and a very particular kind of attention that almost nobody in Robin Williams' professional life had ever offered him before. Before we go any further, I need to ask you for something quickly. I see comments every single week from people who have watched this channel for months without realizing they were never subscribed. Take 10 seconds right now. Check. It costs nothing, and it means the next story reaches you the moment it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now let's go back. Not to the Tonight Show stage. To a comedy club in San Francisco in 1976, where a 25-year-old performer was already becoming legendary for an energy that even his fellow comedians found almost impossible to describe. And to a public television studio in Pittsburgh, where a soft-spoken minister with a background in child development was quietly building something that television executives across the country did not understand, and, for years, did not particularly value. Robin McLaurin Williams was born in Chicago in 1951 and discovered, early in his life, that comedy could function as a kind of survival mechanism against a childhood that was, by his own later accounts, considerably lonelier than his explosive adult public persona ever suggested. He was a shy, overweight child who spent enormous amounts of time alone, inventing elaborate imaginary worlds and voices to populate the isolation of a large house where his parents were frequently absent. And it was in that specific loneliness, according to people who studied his early development closely, that the seeds of his later comedic genius were planted, an ability to generate an entire universe of characters and voices that had first developed as a private coping mechanism long before it ever became a public performance. By the time he arrived in the San Francisco comedy scene in the mid-1970s, that private imaginative overflow had become something explosive and genuinely unprecedented. A rapid-fire, free associative comedic style that moved between voices and characters and ideas with a velocity that left both audiences and fellow comedians genuinely stunned. Jonathan Winters, one of the few comedians whose improvisational gifts were sometimes compared to Williams' own, once said that watching Robin Williams perform live felt less like watching a comedy act and more like watching someone's actual thoughts happening in real time, unfiltered and ungoverned by the ordinary pacing that ordinary human minds impose on themselves. What almost nobody outside his closest circle of friends understood, in those early years and for decades afterward, was the specific cost of generating that much energy that consistently, the particular exhaustion that lived underneath a comedic instrument capable of producing that much material that quickly, and the specific isolation of being, professionally, the most entertaining person in almost every room he ever entered, while privately carrying a loneliness that had never actually been resolved, only channeled into something the world found endlessly delightful. Wait. Because understanding this specific and largely invisible cost is essential to understanding what happened on that Tonight Show stage years later, and why the person best equipped to recognize it was not another comedian, but a man who had spent his entire career studying exactly this kind of hidden childhood loneliness in the children he worked with every single day. Fred McFeely Rogers was born in Latrobe, Pennsylvania in 1928. And his own childhood shared more in common with Robin Williams than almost anyone who has compared the two men publicly has ever fully acknowledged. He was a sickly, overweight child, frequently bullied, who spent significant portions of his early years alone, and who discovered, in that same isolation, an intense, private, imaginative life built around puppets and invented characters that he used to process feelings he did not yet have the vocabulary to express directly. He trained remarkably, not primarily as a performer, but as a child development specialist, studying at the Graduate School of Child Development at the University of Pittsburgh with a rigor and seriousness that almost nobody, who only knew him as a gentle television personality, ever fully appreciated. He understood, with a professional and academically grounded precision, exactly how children processed fear, loneliness, anger, and confusion, and he built an entire television program specifically designed to give children direct, honest, unpatronizing language for those difficult feelings, a program that television executives for years considered too slow, too quiet, and too emotionally direct to succeed in a medium increasingly dominated by fast-paced cartoon entertainment. What almost nobody understood about Fred Rogers, watching him interact with children on television, was that the specific quality of attention he brought to those interactions, the total, unhurried, completely present focus he gave to whoever was in front of him, was not a performance technique. It was the product of decades of serious professional study into exactly what human beings, and particularly human beings in emotional distress, actually needed from another person in order to feel genuinely safe enough to be honest about what they were experiencing. This is the specific skill that Fred Rogers brought with him onto that Tonight Show stage in 1988, a skill that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with a lifetime of professional training in recognizing exactly when someone in front of him had stopped performing and started, quietly and desperately needing to be truly seen. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Because what happens in the next few minutes on that stage is unlike anything either of these men ever did in public again. Now, back to March of 1988, to a Tonight Show broadcast that nobody involved in producing it expected to become one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in the history of the program. There is a specific detail about the parallel childhoods of these two men that almost nobody has ever fully connected until you understand exactly what happened on that stage. Both Robin Williams and Fred Rogers spent significant portions of their early years essentially alone. Both discovered that inventing voices and characters was a way of surviving that loneliness. And both went on to build entire careers around exactly that same childhood coping mechanism, but they diverged completely in what they built on top of it. Williams took his private imaginative overflow and pointed it outward at increasing velocity, transforming it into a professional instrument designed to produce laughter in rooms full of strangers. A transformation that made him extraordinarily successful and extraordinarily beloved, but that also meant he rarely, if ever, stopped generating that outward-facing energy long enough to examine what it had originally been protecting him from. Fred Rogers took the exact same raw material, the same childhood loneliness, the same private world of invented characters, and turned it inward and downward, specifically toward children who were themselves experiencing a version of that same loneliness, building an entire professional discipline around understanding, with academic rigor, exactly what that loneliness needed in order to be safely acknowledged rather than simply outrun. This is why, according to several people who have studied the relationship between these two men closely, Fred Rogers was uniquely positioned, among almost anyone in Robin Williams' professional orbit, to recognize immediately what was actually happening when Williams' comedic performance suddenly cracked open on that stage. He was not simply witnessing a talented entertainer having an unexpected emotional moment. He was witnessing, with the specific and trained recognition of someone who had spent an entire career studying exactly this phenomenon, a person whose childhood survival mechanism had finally caught up with the adult who had spent decades running from what it had originally been built to protect him from. Wait. Because this specific recognition, this ability to see past the performance to the exact childhood wound generating it, is precisely what allowed Fred Rogers to respond with such immediate and unhesitating clarity, without a single second of the confusion or uncertainty that everyone else in that studio, including Johnny Carson experienced in that same moment. By 1988, Robin Williams was one of the biggest comedic film stars in the world, his career having exploded from stand-up and television into a series of major motion pictures that showcased both his explosive comedic energy and, increasingly, a genuine dramatic depth that critics were only beginning to fully recognize. He had also, by this point, developed a well-documented and publicly acknowledged struggle with cocaine addiction during the early years of his fame, a struggle he had discussed with unusual candor in several interviews, describing the specific way that performing at the intensity his comedy required had, for years, felt sustainable only with chemical assistance, a pattern he said he had worked hard to break following the death of his close friend John Belushi in 1982, an event that had frightened him enough to seek genuine help. The specific circumstances surrounding Belushi's death deserve fuller understanding, because they illuminate exactly what Robin Williams was carrying into that Tonight Show broadcast 6 years later. Williams had been with Belushi at the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Los Angeles on the night before Belushi's fatal overdose, and although Williams himself left before the specific circumstances that led to Belushi's death that night, the proximity of that loss, a fellow comedian whose own explosive talent and whose own private struggles had mirrored Williams in ways that frightened him deeply, produced a specific reckoning that Williams later described as one of the genuine turning points of his adult life. He got sober. He stayed sober, by most accounts, for the better part of the following 2 decades, a genuine and hard-won achievement that friends and colleagues consistently praised as evidence of real personal discipline and real personal growth. But sobriety, as Williams himself acknowledged in later interviews, had not resolved the underlying exhaustion that had originally made chemical assistance feel necessary, the specific and cumulative fatigue of an entertainer whose entire public identity depended on generating an almost superhuman level of comedic energy on demand, in every interview, every talk show appearance, every public moment, regardless of what he was actually experiencing privately underneath that performance. He had simply learned, in the years following Belushi's death, to generate that same relentless energy without chemical assistance, which meant that the underlying cost, the specific depletion that comes from constantly producing more than you privately have available to give, had never actually been addressed, only redirected into a form that appeared, to the outside world, considerably healthier and more sustainable than it may have actually been. Fred Rogers, meanwhile, had become, by 1988, a genuine and somewhat unexpected cultural institution, his program having run successfully for 2 decades, his specific quiet philosophy of childhood emotional honesty having slowly earned the kind of serious critical respect that had eluded him in the program's earlier years. Johnny Carson had wanted, for some time, to pair these 2 men on his stage, understanding, with the specific instinct that had made him one of the most perceptive interviewers in American television, that the contrast between them, explosive comedic chaos alongside deliberate, quiet presence, would produce genuinely compelling television, though even Carson could not have fully predicted exactly how compelling that contrast would ultimately become. The broadcast began exactly as Carson had hoped, with Robin Williams delivering 6 uninterrupted minutes of genuinely explosive comedic material, moving between voices and characters and rapid-fire observations, with a velocity that had the studio audience laughing so continuously that several people later described genuine physical exhaustion from the sustained response. Fred Rogers sat beside him throughout this opening segment, watching with visible delight, laughing genuinely at Williams' material, occasionally offering a quiet, perfectly timed response that Williams would seize upon and spin into an entirely new comedic direction. It was, by every account of everyone present, some of the most purely entertaining live television the show had produced in years. And then, according to the production staff who were present, something shifted. It happened during a specific bit, according to multiple accounts, in which Williams was performing an increasingly manic extended riff built around childhood loneliness, a bit that had begun as pure comedy, but that seemed, as it continued, to be drawing from something considerably more personal and considerably less comfortable than the material's comedic framing initially suggested. Williams' voice, according to the show's sound engineer who reviewed the tape afterward, began carrying a specific edge underneath the comedic delivery, something that sounded, on close listening, less like performance and more like something genuinely difficult finding its way out through the only channel Williams had ever fully trusted to express it. Wait. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Robin Williams stopped mid-sentence. The studio audience, still laughing from the previous several minutes of material, took a moment to register that something had changed. The specific delayed recognition of an audience whose response has not yet caught up to a shift that has already occurred on stage. Williams' face, which had been in constant explosive motion for the better part of 10 minutes, went suddenly and completely still and then, just as suddenly, crumpled into something that was unmistakably not comedic, his hands rising to cover his own face, his shoulders beginning to shake in a way that the cameras caught, clearly, and that several audience members later described as genuinely alarming, precisely because it arrived with absolutely no warning. After so many minutes of pure explosive joy, he stood up. He stumbled slightly, moving away from his chair, away from the desk, toward the open edge of the stage, his hands still pressed against his face, his entire body carrying a quality of collapse that nobody in that studio, including Johnny Carson, who had interviewed Williams multiple times before, had ever witnessed from him in public. The studio audience's laughter died completely, replaced by a specific stunned silence, several people half rising from their seats, genuinely uncertain whether they were witnessing a breakdown or, given Williams' established reputation for genuinely unpredictable performance choices, some kind of elaborate extension of the comedic bit that had just concluded. Johnny Carson began to rise from his own chair, his expression carrying genuine alarm, uncertain exactly how to respond to a moment that fell so far outside anything his decades of hosting experience had prepared him for. Fred Rogers moved first. He stood up from his own chair without a single second of visible hesitation. The same unhurried but completely purposeful movement that had defined his approach to every child he had ever worked with in over 20 years of television, and walked directly toward Robin Williams, who was standing at the edge of the stage with his hands still pressed against his face, his shoulders still shaking. Rogers did not say anything at first. He simply reached out and took one of Williams' hands, gently pulling it away from his face and held it in both of his own. The specific and total physical presence that had made him, for 2 decades, one of the only adults many American children ever encountered on television who actually seemed to be paying complete and undivided attention to them rather than performing attention for a camera. Williams looked at him. His face, tear-streaked and completely unguarded in a way that millions of people watching had never seen before, carried an expression that several people present described afterward as something close to relief. The specific relief of someone who has spent years being extraordinarily entertaining and has just, for the first time in longer than he could remember, been offered simple, unhurried, undemanding presence instead. Fred Rogers said, quietly enough that the boom microphone barely caught it, but clearly enough that it has since been confirmed by multiple people who reviewed the broadcast tape, "You don't have to be funny right now. I'm right here." Williams made a sound that was half laugh and half something considerably more raw, and then he said, his voice cracking, "I don't know when I forgot that." Rogers held his hand for a long moment without responding. The specific and deliberate silence that he had spent decades understanding was often more valuable than any words a person in distress could be offered. What followed was not, in any conventional sense, entertainment. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from behind his own desk, made the decision, according to the production staff present, not to redirect the segment back toward its original comedic framing, understanding, with the specific instinct that had made him the most trusted interviewer in American television, that what was happening in front of him mattered considerably more than the broadcast's original entertainment structure. Fred Rogers guided Robin Williams gently back toward the chairs, sitting down beside him, still holding his hand, and asked him, quietly, what had actually happened, what had pulled him so suddenly away from the joy that had defined the previous 10 minutes. Williams, after a long moment, said that he honestly did not fully know, that something about the specific bit he had been performing, built around a child's loneliness, had suddenly stopped feeling like comedic material and had started feeling, without any warning, like something considerably closer to his own actual childhood, and that the specific velocity of his own performance style, the thing that had always felt like his greatest gift, had suddenly felt, for just a moment, like something he had never actually had the chance to stop and examine. He said that he was not sure he had ever, in his entire adult life, simply sat still long enough to let himself feel something without immediately transforming it into a joke. Fred Rogers listened to this with the complete, unhurried attention that had defined his entire professional life. And then he said something that Robin Williams would later describe, in a private conversation shared with a close friend years afterward, as one of the most important things anyone had ever said to him. Rogers said that the same imagination that had allowed Williams to survive a lonely childhood by inventing an entire universe of voices and characters was, in its origin, exactly the same imagination that Rogers himself had spent his entire career trying to protect in children, and that there was nothing wrong or broken about needing, occasionally, simply to stop performing that imagination and let someone else witness the person underneath it. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an evening of comedic entertainment, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they had ever experienced at a live television taping. Nobody applauded immediately when Williams finally composed himself and thanked Rogers, quietly, for what several people present understood was not simply a moment of television, but something considerably more personally significant for Williams himself. When the applause finally did come, it carried a specific and sustained quality entirely different from the earlier explosive laughter, the sound of an audience honoring something genuinely true rather than simply responding to entertainment. NBC's switchboard, according to the production staff who monitored it, received calls throughout the remainder of that evening and into the following days from viewers who described the segment as one of the most moving things they had ever witnessed on television. Many of them specifically describing their own recognition of the exhausting performance of constant cheerfulness that Robin Williams had just, for a few unguarded minutes, allowed the entire country to see him set down. Several of those calls, according to the production staff member who kept a log of viewer responses that week, came from people working in professions that demanded a similar kind of constant public performance. Teachers, salespeople, customer service workers, people whose jobs required them to maintain an outward appearance of relentless positivity regardless of what they were actually experiencing privately. And many of these callers specifically said that watching Robin Williams collapse, and watching Fred Rogers' immediate and unhesitating response to it, had given them language for an exhaustion they had never quite been able to articulate before. One caller, a schoolteacher from Ohio, reportedly told a production staff member that she had cried through the entire segment, not because she was particularly familiar with either man's work beyond their public reputations, but because she recognized, with sudden and overwhelming clarity, that she had spent 15 years in a classroom performing the same kind of relentless cheerfulness that Robin Williams performed on stages, and that she had never once, in 15 years, had anyone offer her what Fred Rogers had just offered him, the simple and explicit permission to stop. This response, multiplied across thousands of similar calls and letters received by NBC in the weeks following the broadcast, suggested that what had happened on that Tonight Show stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of two extraordinary men. A broader and largely unspoken cultural exhaustion among people whose livelihoods depended on performing an emotional state they did not always genuinely feel, and a broader hunger, largely unmet in ordinary daily life, for the specific kind of unhurried, undemanding presence that Fred Rogers had spent an entire career learning how to offer. Robin Williams referenced that broadcast in later years, in interviews given after Fred Rogers' death in 2003, describing it as one of the defining moments of his entire public life, a moment when someone had finally offered him permission to simply exist without performing, a permission he said he had rarely been offered by anyone else across his entire career. He said that Fred Rogers had understood something about the specific loneliness underneath extraordinary talent that almost nobody else in his professional life had ever fully recognized, and that the simple, unhurried quality of Rogers' attention that evening had taught him something about presence that he tried, imperfectly and inconsistently, to carry with him for the rest of his own life. Fred Rogers, for his part, rarely discussed the broadcast publicly in specific detail, consistent with his lifelong and deeply held belief that moments of genuine emotional vulnerability belonged primarily to the person experiencing them rather than to public commentary. But people close to him said he considered it one of the clearest demonstrations, in his entire career, of a principle he had spent decades trying to teach children, that everyone, regardless of age or fame or talent, occasionally simply needed someone else to notice when the performance had become too heavy to keep carrying alone, and to offer, without judgment or demand, the simple and profoundly rare gift of complete, unhurried presence. If this story has moved you tonight, I want you to sit with something for a moment before you close this video. Robin Williams spent his entire career transforming a childhood loneliness into something the world found endlessly delightful, and it took one moment of genuine, unhurried presence from a man who had spent decades studying exactly how to offer that presence to finally give him permission to simply stop performing, even briefly, and let someone see the exhaustion underneath the joy. Think about the people in your own life who might be carrying a similar exhaustion right now. People whose extraordinary energy or talent or humor has become, without anyone fully realizing it, a performance they no longer know how to set down. You do not need Fred Rogers' decades of professional training to offer someone that same gift. You simply need to notice and to be willing to say, quietly, "You don't have to be funny right now. I'm right here." If you have not yet joined this channel's community, please consider doing so now. The link is below, and becoming a member helps make these deeply researched stories possible for everyone who watches. Please like this video if it moved you tonight, because every single like helps this story find someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already so the next story reaches you the moment it is ready. And in the comments below, tell me, has someone in your life ever offered you that kind of unhurried presence at exactly the moment you needed it most? Tell me about it. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is performing a version of themselves that has become exhausting to maintain, waiting for someone brave enough to simply take their hand and tell them they don't have to be funny or strong or entertaining right now. There is one final detail about that broadcast that deserves to be understood more fully, something that only becomes visible when you examine what both men did in the years immediately following. Robin Williams, according to people close to him, began, in the months after that Tonight Show appearance, deliberately building small pockets of genuine stillness into his otherwise relentlessly demanding schedule. Brief periods, sometimes only minutes, when he would simply sit quietly rather than immediately filling the space with performance, a practice he directly credited in private conversations to what Fred Rogers had shown him was possible in those few unguarded minutes on that stage. It was not, by any means, a complete transformation. The specific exhaustion that had produced that unexpected collapse in 1988 would continue to accumulate across the following decades of his extraordinary career, and the particular struggles that eventually led to his death in 2014 were, by every account, considerably more complex than any single television moment could resolve. But those who knew him well said that he returned, repeatedly, over the years, to that specific memory of Fred Rogers taking his hand and telling him he didn't have to be funny, describing it as one of the few moments in his adult life when he had been offered complete permission to simply exist without earning that existence through constant entertainment. Fred Rogers, for his part, kept a small unmarked note in his personal files, discovered only after his own death in 2003, a single handwritten line that his family recognized immediately as connected to that broadcast, though Rogers himself had never explained its origin to anyone. It read simply, "Sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is stop being funny long enough to let someone see that they are tired." Whether this was something Rogers had said to Williams that evening, something Williams had said to him, or simply Rogers' own private reflection on what he had witnessed, nobody knows.